So, what's trending? Bridging your Catholic faith with your everyday life. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie on Relevant Radio.
Welcome to our weekly marriage hour here on Trending. And for just a moment, we're going to have to focus on this whole cologne topic again. Maybe you were with us on Monday as we talked about love being in the air and creating bonding, lasting memories, and really this scent recognition when you date someone. So we're going to talk about the conversation my husband and I had after the show about cologne. But coming up today during our weekly marriage hour, every Thursday, talking about everything from dating to relationships, today we'll be searching through the great wisdom of Venerable Fulton Sheen. Venerable Fulton Sheen proposes a law for marriage, and in fact, he discusses why pleasure drives us at the beginning of marriage, what to do when the moment of crisis hits in your marriage, how to transition from the drudgery of the relationship and marriage to joy, and really that rediscovering of your spouse. Also, fascinating conversation, which generation has the best marriages and why? That and much more here on Trending. If you have a question during our weekly marriage hour, give us a call. The number is 1-888-914-9149. I'll post a question box up on my Instagram during the break. If you have a question, you will be able to open that and ask your question there as well. Okay, so we're going on and on about cologne on Monday's show. And we're discussing with celebrity and royal matchmaker Christina Pineda how important cologne is to create that scent recognition. Now, that led to a long conversation about wearing cologne still once you're married and so on. So I come downstairs after the show and I'm talking to my husband. By the way, I record from home remotely. And I said, so we're talking about cologne and I had a breakthrough today. You know how I always ask you not to wear your cologne? I said, yes. I said, I like cologne, but I realize I just don't like the cologne you have now. And I realized, he's like, okay, well, you can pick out my cologne. I said, okay, we can pick it out. I said, but listen, this was his response. I don't want to smell like food. Why would I make you smell like food? And he said, because you make yourself smell like food. I don't want to smell like cocoa butter. I don't want to smell like figs. I don't want to smell like vanilla. I don't want to smell like food, okay? And I was just cracking up like, why would I make you smell like food? Anyways, it just made me think about how important scent is to us. It really does create memories. It creates a conversation piece for some, but really memories and is a part of binding us to one another. It's one of our five senses. And funny story, actually, he mentioned cocoa butter, like, please don't make me smell like cocoa butter. Before we were dating, we would carpool to classes in college sometimes. And he told me a while after we started dating that he said, remembers one day getting into the car and thinking that the car just smelled awful. He could not stand the smell that was in the car. And he was like, oh, are you wearing like lotion or something? I said, oh yeah, I've got cocoa butter. I'm wearing cocoa butter. I've learned that my husband can't stand cocoa butter, so I do not wear cocoa butter. When he's out of town, those are the days that I slather on the cocoa butter. It actually brings a lot of memories back for me because my great-grandmother used to slather herself in cocoa butter every night. So I hold that for when my husband's out of town. Okay, so here's the deal. Venerable Fulton Sheen has so much wisdom for us to draw on with regard to marriage. And actually, there's a really funny joke I want to play for you where he's talking about hell, husbands, and marriage. Listen to this.
And apropos of marriage, my angel was telling me a good one. It seems as if he was looking down into hell the other day from a great distance. And Satan was looking over all of the newcomers, and they were really flooding in. But there was one individual who came in who was strutting up and down like a peacock. And the devil said to him, says, you act as if you owned the place. He said, I do. My wife gave it to me.
Oh, boy. This poor man. But isn't that true? Isn't that what marriage can become? Well, I deserve this cynicism, this bitterness, this anger, this resentment because my spouse gave it to me. And here this man is. The butt of the joke is the man ends up in hell as if he owns a place. Well, he thinks he has the right to be there. Why? Well, his spouse gave it to him. But doesn't that bring up the topic? I mean, we can laugh at it for a moment, but how we interact in our marriages, how we let our marriages and our spouses impact us and our souls, and ultimately where we'll end up, is actually quite a serious topic. And that's why Venerable Fulton Sheen speaks of 3 phases in marriage, really to help us address and walk through the pain, and might I even say, the tedious moments of marriage that occur. He starts by talking about how every single love, every single pleasure has a momentary phase. And there are 3 phases that he talks about. He talks about 1 being the transient pleasure, that emotion that comes and goes. We could really focus on it as this idea of almost a desire, a pleasure. I've talked before about part of the great dimension of going on a vacation is just the anticipation of it, those emotional feelings that stir up our excitement with regard to going on the vacation. The second level of moments in every love and every pleasure is the crisis. And I'll give an example of that in a moment. The third is the permanent joy. So, for example, the transient pleasure that Venerable Fulton Sheen shows is perhaps you really want to go swimming. There's this idea of I'll really enjoy swimming. I would really be cooled off. This Midwest humidity is awful. And the swimming sounds great. It's a perceived pleasure, but also a delight to even think about. But then there's a moment of crisis because maybe I'm going to go swimming in a lake. And that lake, although it's summer, is freezing. And so there's that moment of crisis over what? The cold water. But then you endure the cold water, you get through the crisis if you choose to go in, and next thing you know, you have that permanent joy, that lasting joy and experience that you've just participated in, where you're cooled off, you made it through the crisis, you slowly tiptoed in, or maybe you dove right in, got over it, and really swam until you warmed up quickly. But he said this actually happens with marriage as well. And the question that all of us must ask ourselves is, will you tackle the crisis, endure the trial, and draw them up into the love you have to show yourself and others, and achieve that joy and peace, that lasting joy and peace? Or will you find yourself floundering, giving up, and quitting as the going gets tough? This is the crisis of today, and it'll be relevant throughout the conversation as we even discuss which generations have the best marriages and why. So let's talk about those 3 moments of marriage, and we'll be discussing them throughout the show today. Why does pleasure drive us at the beginning of marriage? Well, it's part of what drives us just in the dating process. That delighting in another person. Almost a sense of ecstasy over how wonderful the other person is and how wonderful the two of you are together. In fact, many married couples or even just dating couples think that they're the best. We'll be the couple that sticks together. We'll be the people that have the great relationship. We'll always be happy. I find this fascinating because if you talk about the various levels of happiness, the lowest level of happiness is a level where we stick to just comparing ourselves to others. It's a level of comparison. Well, I'm happy because at least I don't have that going on. At least my marriage is still together, even though it hurts, right? Or I'm happy because at least I have a nice car. Or I'm happy because you could go through any number of topics. And you're always finding a reason why you're okay while putting yourselves up in comparison to others. Social media is a perfect example of this. And so it's fascinating to me because that first level, that moment of pleasure in a marriage is fleeting. 1, because it's based on transient ecstasy. That is a momentary feeling that goes away. That transient ecstasy, as Venerable Fulton Sheen points out, isn't forever. There's no promise that it will be forever. That joy of your wedding day, that pleasure of dating, the pleasure of proposing, all of those moments don't stay. Some might say, well, why should I marry? Well, that's what the apostles said when Jesus Christ told them what marriage was. It's not going to be easy. And sure, some people aren't called to it. And this is why we have to beg the question, why is pleasure so fundamental to those years of dating and that time of engagement and even the early years of marriage? Well, because attraction is a fundamental part of developing a relationship, enjoying spending time with someone. But at the same time as that pleasure and joy, and this is relevant to anyone who's dating and discerning marriage, as much as all of that joy and that conversation, the spark and the attraction that's there is great, don't be distracted by it. Beauty and looks are fleeting. The easier things in life go away and greater challenges come. Even if it's just that honeymoon phase, it can be a great phase, but also can be a great challenge as you argue over temperature, dishes, and you name it, those various things that come up. Even though there's that early marital euphoria. So remember that phase of pleasure will not last forever. And you have to remind yourself that even as those phases come, as you enter into your marriage, as you transition along through various stages in life, the great enjoyment comes and goes, but the choice is always present. And this is what brings us to that second level, that moment in every type of love that Venerable Fulton Sheen refers to as the crisis. He refers in marriage that the crisis in marriage is actually having to do with personality and difference of personality. I find this fascinating. That Venerable Fulton Sheen on the radio, on television, back in the 60s, he knew what was up. Have you heard anyone say, we just aren't in love anymore. We're incompatible. We've fallen out of love. Have you seen where perhaps those couples divorce, and there are other couples where the man just dives fully into his work and business, and the woman dives into maybe her work, or only the children, in separating herself from the spouse. Or maybe it's social media or shopping or whatever she chooses to distract herself and give her all to, while still remaining married, in a way abandoning the marriage and the spouse while still standing there. And so as we talk about these differences in personality, I think it's important because we were talking about this on Monday here during our happy hour. And we're talking really about kind of how the challenge today with living together before marriage is that you focus, when you move in together prior to marriage, on all the bad habits and annoying things that the other person does, rather than focusing on their character. And so rather than focusing on their character, you think about, well, I couldn't, stick with this, or you annoy me because you always leave the toilet lid up, or you always leave your clothes on the floor. You always leave dishes in the sink. We could go on, a litany, different reasons for different people. You see, this is the crisis. I think a lot of people are allowing the crisis to enter in without any commitment. So many people are moving in with one another prior to getting married, and very quickly the crisis comes. Their lives are tangled together in a way that's meant to only occur in marriage, and there's great confusion about what we do. Which is why, since there was no vow of fidelity in marriage, there's a tremendous amount of infidelity when people live together and move in together. There's a tremendous amount of people leaving, never committing to marriage, because there's confusion about what marriage is. You see, the crisis is what everyone's afraid of, yet many people stay stuck in. And yet the crisis is exactly what's preventing people from getting married. Because when you don't have fidelity, that glue that holds marriage together, that mutual mission, well, we've lost everything behind marriage. And that's the challenge why many people live in fear in their marriages. Let's listen to this little clip from Venerable Fulton Sheen where he yet again talks about this specific transition, this second moment in marriage where the couple is in crisis.
There come increasing dissatisfactions, and there may even be, for those who do not understand the law of life, a protesting and a blaming of the other partner for having cheated him. For she promised to be a goddess, and she was not a goddess. This is the moment when the cooing stops and the billing starts.
I love that. She promised to be a goddess. She wasn't a goddess. This is when he says the cooing stops and the billing starts. You know, when you're in love, or when you think about a little baby and there's this delight and the oohs and the ahs of the child, and then the kid keeps you up all night like my kid's been doing for a couple weeks now. Or maybe your spouse starts to do something that upsets you. They're not as thoughtful or as considerate. They stay late at work. Whatever it might be. Next thing you know, you start counting what you did for your spouse. And you start comparing yourself to your spouse. That's part of the crisis. Well, I did the dishes. I took care of the baby today. I took care of this. I did that. What did you do? And you start comparing yourself with your spouse. There's no vow having to do with comparison. When someone does 90% and you do 10%, yes. Patrick, exactly. It's I, me. Isn't that so sad? That's what this next generation has been referred to, the I-gen. The I-gen, because it becomes about me. You see, marriage at a certain point, Venerable Fulton Sheen says, becomes luggage. And you only get what you packed into the luggage. That's how we look at it. And isn't it interesting? That's kind of how we go into marriage. We pack our bag. We have all these hopes and dreams. We have everything that we intend to be when we start our marriage. And then here we are. We unpack everything. And wow, I'm deficient. This is hard. It's hard to give my all. It's hard to give 110% when my spouse can maybe only give 5% for the moment. It's hard to only give 20% when my spouse is giving 100% right now. And I say that because the numbers don't add up, because the reality is it never will and it never has in any marriage. But then that's when people start to say, well, we fell out of love. We're incompatible. Or we start to stay longer at work. We stay away from the home. We dive only into the children and avoid one another. This is all of what Venerable Fulton Sheen emphasizes, that people start to say life together has nothing more to offer. So you start growing apart. But Venerable Fulton Sheen speaks so wisely, and he says, this is not the end of love. This is merely the death of an illusion. They have not hit the bottom of love. No one ever does. They have only hit the bottom of their instincts. Now, if they will only persevere, and we use a different kind of food. This is really important to ponder the words Venerable Fulton Sheen here. This isn't the end of love. That moment when people give up, the incompatibility, they fell out of love, life isn't fun together anymore, the spark just isn't present, whatever you've heard someone say, this is the moment of crisis in any type of love or pleasure. Where in order to be better bonded to that very thing that you love and you desire, it takes work. It takes a challenge. And some people might say, oh, but I proposed. Oh, but I bought the ring. Oh, I bought the house. Oh, I got the job. Oh, we had the child. Oh, it will always be something. It will always be something. Life comes in transitions. Oh, it'll be the family member who died. It'll be the family member who had to move in with you. It'll be the family member who's sick. It'll be the loss of a job. It'll be a move across the country, whatever it might be. Venerable Fulton Sheen says, this is not the end of love. This is merely the death of an illusion. We create illusions about what marriage is. And we hold on to that illusion, then when it doesn't fit our perfect box of what we wanted, we start to harbor resentment and frustration. We allow ourselves, and note, to fall into a depression and anxiety maybe even a hatred and rancor, sense of rancor for our spouse. Venerable Fulton Sheen says they have not hit the bottom of love. No one ever does. They've only hit the bottom of their instincts. That is their instinct of what they thought, the illusion, the creativity, the imagination that they thought things would be. Now, if you will only persevere and use a different kind of food in your marriage, that moment of crisis is the death of the illusion. It's not the end of love. And it's so important that we recognize this in marriage. This is why there are moments of crisis. This is why there's a way to get out of that crisis. And this is why we have to get past the pleasure and the comparison of love. We have to get past the moment of a crisis and fear and move to the next level. And we'll come back here during our weekly marriage hour, continuing with the wisdom of Venerable Fulton Sheen, discussing how to rediscover your spouse, overcome the drudgery to find true joy and peace in your marriage. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie. If you have a question, the number is 1-888-914-9149. And what generation do you think has had the best marriages? We'll answer that question in just a little bit. Catholic Order of Foresters is proud to sponsor the Relevant Radio Studio line. For information about employment opportunities and flexible premium life insurance plans, visit relevantradio.com/Forester.
Bridging your Catholic faith with your everyday life. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie on Relevant Radio and the Relevant Radio app.
Welcome back to our weekly marriage hour here on Trending. It's great to be with you. We're pulling from the great wisdom of Venerable Fulton Sheen. And in fact, if you didn't know this, Venerable Fulton Sheen is on Relevant Radio every Sunday at 8 a.m. Central. There's so much to pull from his thoughts. In fact, often I'll pull up his sermons and just listen to them while I'm driving or cleaning. So if you want to listen, check out Relevant Radio and the Relevant Radio app, where you can listen to Venerable Fulton Sheen on demand. If you have a question, the number is 1-888-914-9149. If you have a question during our marriage hour, you can always ask on my Instagram. Just head over there now. I'm putting it up right now. You can ask your question in the question box. You can find me at Timmerie, Timmerie. So I want to continue to walk through the wisdom. I spoke about the crisis that every marriage goes through, that every love and every sentence of pleasure goes through. But then the third thing, so if you're just joining us, Venerable Fulton Sheen lays out 3 moments that every love and every pleasure has. The transient pleasure, where everything's great, everything's wonderful, but it's fleeting. The second would be the crisis, where if you want to go swimming, you have to endure getting into the cold water. You have those challenges in marriage. But how do we overcome the challenges? How do we overcome this idea of, oh, well, I fell out of love, or we're no longer compatible, or this, her personality just simply isn't the same anymore? This is what we have to overcome. This is the challenge. And this is where Venerable Fulton Sheen said, as I mentioned before, this is not the end of love. This is merely the death of an illusion. That is the illusion of what you thought marriage would be. The illusion of what you thought love was. That is love without the work. And it's fascinating because it can be really easy to love someone when our love, our total giving of them, is for the pleasure that that person gives us. So early on in the marriage, we can say, well, we just don't love each other anymore. You thought that you loved that person totally and completely. Well, it's because your love, you were totally pouring yourself out, because at that time, you were receiving this incredible pleasure that that person was giving back to you. And so here we are. How do we overcome the illusion? How do we get through the crisis in marriage? Well, Venerable Fulton Sheen talks about, in the midst of this anxiety, the crisis, the kids, the sacrifice, the boredom, the exhaustion, and the disappointment, we need a new type of food for the love that we have. He talks about how this third phase, this third moment, is when the soul leads the body. The body is no longer leading the soul. Isn't that fascinating? Because we live in a time and a place where we do often focus on the body first. How we look, how we measure up, how we compare to one another. And we're forgetting that not only do I have a soul, but the other person has a soul too. And that soul is something to be treasured, protected, and is ultimately created to be in heaven. Or we've gotten to a point where we'll talk about, I'll pray for you. I'll talk about, it's interesting in theology, we've lost kind of some of the phrasing in just common conversation where we talk about the salvation of a soul rather today we talk about saving a person. Well, yes, this person is body and soul, but in our modern language, we've lost the reality that we have a soul that's created to be with God in eternity, and based on our decisions, that determines where we'll go, heaven or hell or purgatory. So we need to return to this idea that Venerable Fulton Sheen refers to as a soul that leads the body. He said in the first moments it was the body that led the soul, and now it is the soul that leads the body. This is the new food of love, where we now discover that the other person isn't just some transient pleasure that we delight in, which delighting in each other is a great thing, but the other person has a mind. The other person has a heart. The other person has a personality that perhaps may have developed and be transformed. That the other person is someone to be loved, and the other person, in fact, is a mystery to be discovered. That we don't fully know and understand every little thing about that person. That is our spouse. It's easy to make assumptions about the way the other person's thinking in their private intellectual life, to make assumptions about what other people are doing when they're not with you. Venerable Fulton Sheen says, now is the time for the soul to lead the body, and now together, by the mysterious force beyond themselves, they will do this. What's that mysterious force beyond themselves? Well, it's us walking side by side, shoulder to shoulder with our spouse toward God, looking out and seeing the world with the eyes of charity. You see, today, the modern definition of love and marriage is you and I gazing into our eyes, falling in love with each other, and having pleasurable romantic experiences of traveling the world and having children if and when we want on our time, and having the perfect child who is an absolute genius and performs perfectly in any academics or sports or curricular activities that we so choose. That's what we think love is, a looking face to face. But in reality, love is more like looking out side by side and pondering the great mission before us. Venerable Fulton Sheen said, remember, it's love that creates beauty. And in fact, he was talking about how this was a type of love that used to be seen in his parents' generation. He was speaking right around the time of the 60s. But now, today, people say, well, people fall in love and out of love. Their personality changed, we're incompatible. But you see, what's happened today is people are no longer falling in love with a person that is personal and has an intellect and a will and a mind and is a mystery to be discovered. Instead, Venerable Fulton Sheen said this all those years ago, and it's still prevalent today, but all the more so. Today, people fall in love, essentially, with an experience. And they want to stay in that experience. They want to stay in that euphoria and remain there forever, delighting in it, nothing to change it. I remember some years ago, a couple friends of mine got married. They lived next door to me. And when they got pregnant with their first kid, I remember the wife looking at me and saying, yeah, it was kind of just weird. It's like we were just constantly focusing on like this love that just the two of us had. We were out, we were loving our family, loving our friends, doing various ministry work. But at the same time, she said, it was very clear that something more was meant to be present. We were supposed to give ourselves totally in motherhood and fatherhood. It's an emphasis and a reminder that we're not supposed to just stay in that honeymoon and never come out. We're supposed to go into a mission, and that mission is to marry your spouse and to choose your spouse. And remember, your mission is to help get your spouse to heaven, toward the procreation and education of children, and to charity toward others, and to be an influence and a witness to others of Christian marriage. But you see, even the apostles got it wrong. Venerable Fulton Sheen talks about how Peter, James, and John, at the Transfiguration, when Jesus went up Mount Tabor and he was transfigured like he would be at his resurrection, glistening, this white robes, and he's elevated into the heavens above him, and there appear Moses and Elijah representing the law and the prophets. And there's a divine revelation, a voice from heaven, referring to Jesus Christ as the beloved Son. The God yet again affirms and compliments. And what's fascinating is that Peter, James, and John actually want to create a home there on the hill. They don't want to leave. They want to stay there in that moment and have this glorious moment last forever. But what Venerable Fulton Sheen says, because if you don't remember the story, Peter, James, and John are like, okay, Lord, let us create some tents. We'll stay here with you. We'll stay here with Elijah. We'll stay here with Moses. This is incredible. God's speaking from a cloud in heaven. You are in your transfigured self. We are seeing the dead are risen, Moses and Elijah. We want to stay here forever. But what Venerable Fulton Sheen points out is that the apostles in that moment fell in love with what he refers to as the glory of a promise. The Transfiguration was just a taste of what God had in store for them. And they loved it. And they didn't want to leave it. They found it so delightful and pleasurable. That moment was an incredible moment for the apostles. But what Venerable Fulton Sheen emphasizes is that the apostles had to go down from the mountain, down from the moment of the glory of the Transfiguration, the foretaste of the resurrected Lord, the foretaste of heaven on earth, where Elijah and Moses are present, conversing face to face with God, Jesus Christ. And so not only do the apostles have to go down that hill, go down Mount Tabor, but they then have to go up another hill to Calvary, headed to Golgotha. And there they have to face the moment of death, the moment of crisis, the moment of tragedy, the moments of disappointment that every single marriage experiences. Venerable Fulton Sheen says, now this is what surpasses all understanding. This is the law of life, and this is the law of love. The idea is great. The ideal is wonderful. What the Catholic Church teaches about marriage sounds fantastic, but boy, is it hard. Jesus Christ is a perfect model of absolute and perfect self-giving love. Unconditional love. And guess what? Look at the crucifix. He was bloody, he was bruised, and he was beaten. He had been tortured to death. And even then, he gave his life as a gift to God. Into your hands I commend my spirit. Even in that moment, in all of his agony and suffering, and the pain he had endured, imagine one hand nailed to the cross, the other hand nailed to the cross, his feet nailed to the cross, all the pressure and weight pulling down on his arms, and we complain over a little neck ache, a shoulder ache. Imagine the weight of your whole body hanging on the cross with nails, sharp, rusty, old, rugged nails, and that's the weight of your body hanging. And there's a crown of thorns on you, and you've just received all the lashes. You're sweating blood from the agony in the garden. And yet still in that moment, he turns and looks at his beloved apostle, the only apostle there at the foot of the cross. And he still cares so much for you and I. He cares so much for his apostles that he's even in that moment totally self-giving, and that he cares enough to say, here, take care of my mother, and here, I give my mother to you. That moment of Jesus asking John to take care of his mother, that's very important, but even more so is a moment of Jesus giving his mother to John. Because in that moment, Jesus is giving his mother to us. In that moment, he's giving us his everything, his all in all here on earth. You see, we have to travel to Calvary. We have to come off of the glory of the transfiguration, recognize that we have to finish the story. The story doesn't end at the transfiguration of Jesus Christ there with Peter, James, and John at Mount Tabor. The story still continues. It's just a glimpse of the promise and the glory. And remember, this is what we have to recall when we ponder marriage. This is what's so important. That, as Venerable Fulton Sheen says, we have to find a new type of food for our love and marriage. And so this brings us to the question, how do we go from drudgery to joy in marriage? Well, the church gives us a number of things. Number one, they emphasize that that marriage is oriented toward the procreation and education of children. Why? Because children give you a mutual mission, and boy, is that hard. I have no idea what's in store for me. I only have a glimpse. I'm a new mom, 5-month-old baby. And let me tell you, the last week and a half of next to no sleep has been rough. It's been frustrating. I can't even imagine all the moments that are to come. But what I do know is that this is a mission that God has given us, and this is the mission that the church presents over the span of the history of the Catholic Church, the procreation and education of children. This is the responsibility of parents, to mutually give themselves while still loving one another in their marriage, to love one another, and in their love to also love together their children, not to separate one of themselves and just one of them love their children and not love the other spouse. You see, love is an action word. It's a choice. Yet for some reason we live at a point in time where we believe that love is a feeling. And we fall in love with what we think love is, and that is an experience. And then there's going to be a day when there's a crash course in reality. And if you really want that person, that thing, that marriage, that family, you have to work for it. You have to jump into the deep end of the cold pool with the cold water and endure those moments of challenge. Now, we could have two approaches. We could have one approach where we say, okay, marriage is going to be hard and I'm just going to endure the suck. That's kind of what our culture does. Embrace the suck, we'll make it work. Embrace the hard moments. Or this is where our faith, our Catholic faith, yet again, can transform these experiences. We recognize that there is such a thing as redemptive suffering. And that when I choose someone else and I deny myself, I can make that a gift, not only to my loved ones, but I can also make it a gift to God. God, I choose you. I choose your cross. I choose the unconditional love that you have shown for others. And I choose to try to unite my suffering to the suffering you experienced. And I offer up the pain so that I might be with you, so that my spouse might be with you, so that my child might be with you. How often do we call upon the Lord to help us in these moments? I'm reminded just in these last, 5 months of being a new mom and having a baby, there's so many moments where it's challenging and baby's not wanting to eat and I'm just sitting there holding her in the middle of the night. And all she wants is to just be there and be at peace. And for her, it's a momentary feeling. It is a feeling of love for her. The feeling of comfort. For me, it's a choice to stay there. It's a choice that can be hard at times. It's a choice that can be easy. But what I realize over and over again is that I can choose to be there, but at the same time as I can choose to be there and I can choose to love her, I can also choose to pray for her. I can choose to pray for her to have chastity in the midst of a culture that is so challenging. I can choose to pray for her to have charity when so many of us struggle to be charitable toward others. I can pray for her to have faith in a world that promotes perpetual skepticism. You see, this is where our faith meets the challenge and the crises of life and of marriage. There is joy, there is goodness in redemptive suffering, and here's the deal, it transforms you. When you give your life for others, when you choose others, when you set others before yourself, when you get up off of that couch when your body aches, when you're exhausted and you're in pain, when you choose to love your family, feed your family with physical food, but also spiritual food of their faith, even when it's hard, even when you'd rather do something else, make it happen. This is the beautiful ideal, and as Venerable Fulton Sheen has emphasized, this surpasses all understanding. This is the law of life, and this is the law of love. You're listening to Confronting with Timmerie here on Relevant Radio. I'll be right back discussing what generation had the best marriages.
So, what's trending? Bridging your Catholic faith with your everyday life. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie on Relevant Radio and the Relevant Radio app.
Welcome back to our weekly marriage hour here on Trending. I'm taking a question from Instagram that came up from Tessie. She said, why is it that my husband and I are happier than ever when we don't have any religion in our lives? It's almost like the lack of ignorance and bigotry brings happiness and joy, true happiness. That's a fascinating question. I'm, just pondering it. This is just my initial reaction as I read the question. Why is it that my husband and I are happier than ever when we don't have any religion in our lives? Well, remember the idea of happiness itself. Just the idea of happiness is an emotion, and it's fleeting. Sometimes the idea of, quote, being free from any obligation or any responsibility sounds really great. Sounds wonderful. But having no religion doesn't require that there is a universal expectation, law to life. And I think that that's the challenge is, how do you know what is true and what is not true? Do you determine on your own? That's called relativism. You determine your truth. What happens when you determine your truth and your spouse determines his truth? And then suddenly at some point, maybe right now, your truths mutually agree with one another, but one day they don't. Where was the founding principle? Where was the cornerstone that held your expectation together? Do you believe in fidelity in marriage? Okay, you believe in fidelity in marriage, but apart from faith and the expectation that God, before God, you make a binding and lasting covenant while on earth to stick together. Well, when you don't have faith, inconsistency does creep into your life. It may not today, but it may later. Remember, joy isn't a feeling, it's not an emotion. It's rooted in God. It's a sense of absolute peace and even stability in God, even in the midst of anything that will come your way. I pray that you have this while married. I pray that you come back to the religion, if that was a religion you originally had in your marriage, or that you rediscover or discover a sense of faith, because the reality is that truth matters. And God gives abundant graces in marriage that are the glue that truly does bring together spouses. And there's so many moments in marriage where you have to come before one another time and time again. I'm sorry, and I'm sorry again. You see, the graces of the sacraments blot out our sins and give us sanctifying grace to persevere in the sacrament of marriage. So although it might be okay now, I pray it stays that way. And I pray that you give your marriage the additional balm of grace and expectation that the Catholic Church, Jesus, founded by Jesus Christ, gives in those expectations. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie here on Relevant Radio. It's great to be with you. I want to unpack this topic of which generation has the best marriages. I was reading an article by Hayden Shaw at Focus on the Family, and it lays out 4 generations. The traditionalists, that is those born prior to 1946. The baby boomers born between 1946 and 64. Then there's Generation X, born between 1965 and 1980. And then the millennials, really from about 1981 until 1996 to 98-ish, depending on where you see the definition. Usually the cutoff is at 1996. And so it compares and really not so much compares, but discusses some of the key elements of marriages in these 4 different groups. And it really talks about how I'm going to start with the traditionalist marriages. It talks about how those born prior to 1946 focus on the idea of finding a good match and having a strong family. And it even comments in the article written by Hayden Shaw that if you were to ask a traditionalist husband, that is someone born prior to 1946, if he was happy when his kids were smaller, because here's the reality, a lot of people say, oh man, marriage was great, everything was so much better when the kids were younger. Well, he says if you were to ask a traditionalist, someone born prior to 1946, this question, he might shrug and not really consider the question. There's an answer, there's a reason. Because to someone born prior to 1946, they didn't think about the idea of being happy in marriage because happiness wouldn't have made the difference. You see, they were focused on loving their spouses, being responsible, providing, taking care of their children. And that things have really changed over the last number of years. You see, people born prior to 1946 have something to offer the younger generations. And that is to stop asking the question, am I happy? That's not the main point of marriage. Fidelity is. Staying through it, through the good times and the bad. You see, today, people leave marriages all too easily. In reality, those born prior to 1946 will often speak that there was a hard decade within their marriage. There was a hard year. There was a hard year that came and went, and then there were another hard 5 years there. There were challenging moments, but the glue that held them together wasn't the idea of, am I happy? It was staying faithful to the mission, standing true to the sense of responsibility. And that love was a choice. And I find this fascinating after we've been going through the work of Venerable Fulton Sheen during this weekly marriage hour here on Trending, because you see how this has been lost in many ways. You see, then you transition to the boomer generation, 1946 to 1964. And this is the generation that really focused on finding their soulmate and having satisfactory intimacy in the bedroom and being accepted no matter what. Didn't matter what they did. Yet these are the marriages that really started to fall apart. The boomer generation. You see, during the 1970s, the divorce rate doubled and then began to decline going into the 80s. You see, the boomer generation has some of the highest divorce rate and continues to be so. See, in this article, it talks about how the boomer generation can both learn and teach something. They have a good sense of having very high expectations and being motivated by them, which expectations are a great thing. But we have to come back to this idea of those born prior to 1946 and their attitude and approach to marriage. That the expectations of the boomer generation of finding that soulmate and being perfectly accepted as is. Yeah, it's great to be accepted. It's great to have expectations. But it's also good to have expectations to fidelity. To have expectations that it's not just about these feelings of being a soulmate and feeling in love. Love is a choice, not a feeling. And then you have Generation X, where they saw the divorce rate double, and it had made them, because of what they saw in the generation before them, very skeptical and apprehensive about marriage. But what Generation X showed is that there really had to be trade-offs when it came to marriage. And they didn't need to focus, as the boomer generation did, as cited in this Focus on the Family article, as much on the perfect house, perfect money. The idea of perfectly standing firm in that second marriage because, everything was about having this legacy and doing it right and having the magical answers. You see, Gen X recognized that marriage was work. And this is why some of them put it off and avoided it. And this is something we see from Gen X into the millennial generation. Millennial generation that's avoiding marriage altogether, getting married even later and later in life. Why? Because they've seen that there's something that's been lost. And so my argument would be today, that's part of the great element of those marriages prior to 1946 is they emphasize fidelity in marriage. They de-emphasized the idea and feeling of happiness, and they took up the idea of responsibility and choice, taking up the responsibility of carrying those entrusted to them, and standing firm in their commitment. Commitment and fidelity mean a lot in marriage. You're listening to our weekly Marriage Hour here on Trending. Coming up tomorrow, we'll talk about Eucharistic miracles having to do with the real heart of Jesus and the Sacred Heart of Jesus.